The Great Smoky Mountains do not easily surrender their dead, and in the damp, thawing spring of 1903, the isolated valley of Oakhaven felt more like a purgatory than a home. It was a deeply secluded, mist-shrouded depression hidden so far off. The mapped, rutted wagon trails that the encroaching modern century had completely failed to find it. Here, generations of hardened, deeply superstitious families lived, bled, and died on the exact same plots of rocky, unforgiving land. The air in Oakhaven was perpetually heavy, carrying the deep, lingering scent of damp pine needles, wood smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of wet slate. When the dense, aggressively thick mountain fog rolled down from the jagged peaks, it swallowed the timber cabins whole, entirely isolating neighbors and muffling the sounds of the valley until the silence became a physical, suffocating weight pressing against the chestnut at the very edge of this hollow. Perched on a slightly elevated ridge of hard-packed red clay sat the ancient sagging timber farmhouse of the Gable family. Inside the dimly lit kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of boiled vinegar and profound, exhausted grief. Cora Gable, 28 years old and possessing the stoic, hardened physical resilience of a woman who had violently wrestled a failing farm into submission since childhood, wiped a thick layer of sweat and soot from her forehead. Beside her stood her younger sister, Maeve. At 26, Maeve was the gentler of the two, her empathetic eyes red-rimmed and heavily shadowed from weeks of relentless weeping. They were actively mourning the monumental, devastating loss of their mother, Eleanor Gable, a woman universally revered and fiercely, aggressively protected by every single soul in the valley. To the struggling people of Oakhaven, Mother Gable was not just a neighbor. She was a living, breathing saint. For over 40 years, she had served as the Hollow's sole midwife, healer, and ultimate matriarch. She was a woman of mythic, practically unnatural endurance who would routinely strap on heavy ashwood snowshoes and walk for miles through blinding, lethal Appalachian blizzards, carrying her worn leather medical bag simply to ensure that the blizzards carrying her worn leather medical bag simply to ensure that the poorest, most desperate families did not lose their wives or infants to the brutal elements. Her funeral, held just 3 days prior in the freezing torrential spring rain, had been attended by the entire Weeping Valley. Grown men, hardened by decades of brutal, limb-crushing timber work, had fallen to their knees in the freezing mud beside her simple pine casket, openly, violently sobbing for the woman who had brought them and their children safely into the harsh world. Before we unearth exactly what the grieving Gable sisters found buried in the dark, I want to take a brief pause to welcome you. If you find yourself captivated by these forgotten, highly atmospheric historical mysteries and the terrifying, dark secrets that rural landscapes desperately try to hide, I would be genuinely thrilled if you subscribe to the channel. We slowly uncover these chilling stories together, and having you here as a part of our community around the fire truly makes it all worthwhile. Now, let's step back into the damp, shadowed kitchen of the Gable farmhouse, where a daughter's profound grief is about to strike iron. The outpouring of communal sympathy for the grieving sisters had been completely overwhelming. Every family in Oakhaven, despite their own meager, starving winter rations, had brought offerings to the farmhouse to honor the saintly midwife. The kitchen was practically overflowing with hundreds of heavy glass mason jars, pickled beets, salted pork, spiced mountain apples, and thick, dark molasses. The sheer volume of the preserved food was staggering, far too massive to fit into the small, cramped wooden pantry. To prevent the glass jars from violently shattering in the wildly fluctuating spring mountain temperatures, the food desperately needed to be stored underground in a climate-controlled space. Cora, fiercely pragmatic and desperately starved for a physical distraction from her suffocating psychological grief, made a heavy, practical decision. For decades, the space beneath their kitchen floorboards had been nothing but a shallow, 2-foot dirt crawl space, barely enough room for a hunting hound to sleep in to escape the wind. She decided they would finally excavate a proper deep winter root cellar directly beneath the house. It was brutal, back-breaking, agonizing labor, deliberately designed to exhaust the physical body so completely that the mind would have absolutely no energy left to mourn. They rolled back the heavy, braided wool rugs, pried up the center pine floorboards with a rusted iron crowbar, and climbed down into the damp, freezing dark of the crawl space. Armed with heavy, flat-headed iron spades and heavy mining pickaxes, the sisters began to violently attack the earth beneath their home. The Appalachian soil was notoriously, aggressively hostile, dense, practically impenetrable mixture of frozen red clay, thick, tangled pine roots, and jagged, broken layers of gray shale. For hours, the only sounds in the isolated house were the rhythmic, heavy thuds of forged iron violently striking packed earth and the harsh, ragged, exhausted breathing of the two women. They dug strictly by the weak flickering amber light of a single brass kerosene lantern, hauling heavy wooden buckets of wet, heavy clay up into the kitchen to be discarded later in the yard dot by the bruised twilight of the late afternoon. They had managed to carve out a rough, circular depression about 4 feet deep into the foundation. Cora raised her heavy iron pickaxe, her back muscles screaming in hot, stabbing protest, and brought the sharp steel point down hard into the exact center of the pit, instead of the jarring, bone-rattling impact of solid clay or buried mountain shale. The iron tip of the pickaxe sank deeply, almost effortlessly, into the floor of the pit with a soft, yielding, and entirely unnatural shhck. Cora froze instantly, the heavy wooden hickory handle slick with her own sweat. She dropped to her knees in the damp dirt, waving Maeve over with a sharp, frantic motion of her hand. Snatching the brass lantern closer to the ground, the weak amber light illuminated a distinct, deeply unsettling geological anomaly in the Vig and the Vamamali in the Kul-Anid. Illuminated a distinct, deeply unsettling geological anomaly in the earth. Directly in the center of their excavation, the hard, impenetrable, natural red clay abruptly stopped, forming a perfect, mathematically straight line. Beyond that line, outlining a massive rectangular shape roughly the size of a large dining table, the soil was completely, fundamentally different. It was incredibly loose, dark, and heavily mixed with fine, white river sand. It was a delicate, specific mixture that absolutely did not naturally occur on this elevated, rocky ridge. The fine sand had to have been painstakingly hauled up from the valley floor in heavy canvas sacks. To a woman raised working the land, the implication was immediate, undeniable, and deeply chilling. This specific rectangular patch of earth had not been formed by nature. It had been meticulously, deliberately dug out, and then intentionally refilled and heavily packed down years, perhaps decades ago, driven by a sudden, frantic mixture of innocent curiosity and a creeping, primal unease. the sisters abandoned their heavy pickaxes and began to frantically dig at the loose, sandy mixture with their smaller hand spades. The earth gave way with terrifying, fluid ease. They dug straight downward, following the perfectly vertical, unnatural dirt walls of the buried trench, the smell of damp soil and ancient, stagnant, forgotten air growing overwhelmingly thick. In the cramped space, they dug another 2 feet down into the dark, their fingernails completely caked in thick black mud until Cora's iron spade violently struck something solid. It produced a dull, heavy, and unmistakably metallic clank that echoed sharply in the small dirt cavern. It was not a buried wagon wheel, and it was not a forgotten, rusted pioneer plow, frantically scraping the wet, sandy loam away with their bare hands. The sisters slowly revealed the top of a massive, incredibly heavy steamer trunk. It was a colossal, imposing piece of luggage, the kind utilized by wealthy transatlantic passengers decades prior, completely and utterly out of place beneath the sagging floorboards of an impoverished mountain farmhouse. The trunk was heavily bound in thick, rusted strips of forged iron, its wooden frame completely wrapped in multiple layers of heavy, tar-soaked canvas explicitly designed to make it entirely waterproof and prevent the wood from rotting in the damp, subterranean earth. But it was the security of the buried object that truly paralyzed the sisters in the flickering lantern light. The massive iron latch of the trunk was not merely closed. It was heavily, aggressively secured by 3 incredibly thick industrial-grade brass padlocks. They were locked tightly from the outside, covered in years of deep green oxidation, permanently sealing away a secret that the beloved saint of Oakhaven had gone to staggering, desperate lengths to ensure would never, ever see the light of day. The sheer, incomprehensible weight of the buried object made its extraction from the damp earth a grueling, agonizing test of physical endurance. For nearly an hour, the isolated farmhouse echoed only with the desperate, ragged gasps of the sisters, and the violent, suctioning sound of wet red clay reluctantly surrendering its hold on the tar-soaked canvas. Cora and Maeve were forced to fetch a thick coil of heavy hemp rope from the barn, looping it securely through the deeply rusted, forged iron handles on either side of the colossal steamer trunk. Using the edge of the floorboards above as a crude pulley, they violently hauled the massive box upward inch by inch, their hands blistered and bleeding, their muscles trembling to the point of absolute failure. When they finally managed to drag the heavy trunk up out of the crawlspace and onto the solid pine floorboards of the kitchen, both women collapsed against the wooden cabinets, utterly exhausted, staring blindly at the dark, mud-caked monolith. Sitting in the center of their home, outside, the bruised, suffocating twilight had completely surrendered to a pitch-black, howling spring night. A violent Appalachian thunderstorm had rolled heavily down from the jagged peaks, plunging the valley into an absolute, localized darkness and battering the heavy slate roof of the farmhouse with a deafening, relentless barrage of freezing rain. The isolation of Oakhaven had never felt more profound or more aggressively impenetrable. As the frantic rhythm of their breathing slowly leveled out, the creeping, primal unease that had seized them in the dirt pit began to be rapidly replaced by a deeply ingrained, innocent pioneer pragmatism. Looking at the heavy brass padlocks and the meticulous, desperate waterproofing, Cora rationalized the discovery. Oakhaven was an old, historically bloody valley. During the brutal, chaotic years of the Civil War, Rogue bands of starving Confederate raiders and ruthless Union bushwhackers had frequently swept through the mountains, burning farms and violently pillaging anything of value. It was a common, deeply entrenched piece of local folklore that the older generation had buried their family silver, their heirloom jewelry, and their meager savings deep in the earth to protect it from the marching armies. Mother Gable, Reason had simply hidden their ancestral inheritance decades ago and, in her declining, exhausted final years, had tragically forgotten to tell them where it was buried. Driven by this comforting, utterly naive assumption, Cora did not hesitate. She wiped the thick, wet clay from her hands onto her coarse wool apron, marched to the heavy stone hearth, and retrieved a long, solid iron pry bar used for shifting burning logs. She knelt beside the massive trunk, wedging the sharp, flattened wedge of the heavy iron tool directly beneath the thick shackle of the first oxidized brass padlock. She braced her heavy leather boots against the wet canvas and violently threw her entire body weight backward. The heavy brass resisted for one agonizing, breathless second before catastrophic structural failure tore through the ancient metal. The padlock violently sheared in half with a deafening, ear-splitting metallic crack that echoed aggressively over the howling thunderstorm outside. Cora moved methodically to the second lock and then the third, the heavy iron pry bar completely destroying the security that their saintly mother had so desperately relied upon. With all three locks shattered and discarded onto the floorboards, Cora gripped the heavy, forged iron latches and pushed upward. The massive, deeply reinforced wooden lid of the trunk was incredibly heavy, the ancient, rusted hinges shrieking in a high, agonizing wail as the vacuum seal of the tar-soaked canvas was finally, irreversibly broken. The immediate, visceral expectation was the foul, suffocating stench of deep rot, of stagnant earth and ancient mildew. But what violently erupted from the interior of the colossal trunk was the exact terrifying opposite. A powerful, overwhelmingly concentrated olfactory wave completely saturated the small, damp kitchen. It was the heavy, almost medicinal scent of aggressive preservation. The air smelled blindingly strong of dried, crushed lavender, the sharp, chemical burning of heavy camphor, dense clusters of toxic white mothballs, and the distinct, incredibly dry scent of ancient, undisturbed paper. It was the unmistakable smell of a meticulous, highly maintained archive, completely at odds with a box buried 6 feet deep in the wet Appalachian clay. Maeve brought the brass kerosene lantern closer, her trembling hand casting a weak, flickering amber light over the edge of the heavy wooden box. The sisters leaned forward, expecting the dull, heavy gleam of tarnished silver ingots, the delicate clatter of pioneer jewelry, or the tightly bound stacks of ancient, obsolete Confederate currency. Instead, they found a deeply disturbing, meticulously organized sea of white. The interior of the massive trunk was not filled with treasure. It was packed to the absolute brim with hundreds upon hundreds of small, identical bundles. They were all precisely the same size, roughly the dimensions of a large loaf of bread, wrapped tightly in incredibly fine, highly expensive white linen. Every single individual bundle was meticulously secured with a tightly knotted length of heavy, jet-black silk ribbon. The sheer, staggering volume of the bundles was paralyzing. There had to be at least 80 or 90 of them, stacked with a terrifying, calculated geometry that maximized every available inch of the heavy wooden trunk. "What is it?" Maeve whispered, her voice a frail, trembling thread that barely cut. Through the sound of the rain hammering the window panes, Cora did not answer. The cold, logical pioneer pragmatism had completely evaporated from her mind, instantly replaced by a deep, stomach-churning dread that practically radiated from the meticulously wrapped linen. She reached down into the heavy scent of camphor and lavender, her dirt-caked fingers carefully lifting the topmost bundle from the pile. It was shockingly light, practically weightless in her calloused hands. She set it gently on the heavy oak dining table, pulling the kerosene lantern closer and slowly, deliberately untied the jet-black silk ribbon. The fine white linen fell away, unfolding to reveal the contents resting in the center of the fabric. The visual completely stripped the remaining breath from the sisters' lungs. It was not a family heirloom. It was a profoundly intimate, terrifyingly macabre shrine. Resting delicately on the pristine linen was a tiny, heavily faded and intricately knitted infant swaddling cloth. The soft, woolen fabric was deeply, aggressively stained with large, dark, rusted patches of old, dried blood. Placed perfectly in the center of the ruined garment was a small, perfectly preserved lock of incredibly fine, pale infant hair, bound tightly at the root by a microscopic thread of white silk, and resting directly beside the hair, staring blindly. Up at the ceiling was a small, intricately hand-carved wooden doll. The doll was deeply unsettling, its wooden face entirely blank, entirely devoid of carved eyes or a mouth, simply a smooth, featureless oval of polished pine, a cold, absolute. Terror violently seized Maeve's chest, driven by a sudden, frantic, and entirely manic desperation to prove that this was an isolated, bizarre anomaly. The younger sister plunged her hands into the trunk. She grabbed 3 more identical linen bundles, throwing them onto the dining table and violently tearing the black ribbons away. The nightmare was entirely, horrifically uniform. Every single bundle contained the exact same macabre trinity of relics. Another blood-stained swaddling cloth. Another perfectly preserved, tied lock of infant hair, some dark brown, some stark blonde, some curling, some straight. Another featureless, staring wooden doll. The isolated farmhouse felt as though it were violently spinning, the oppressive scent of the lavender and camphor making the air so thick it was impossible to breathe. Mother Gable had not buried a fortune in silver to protect it from raiders. She had painstakingly, obsessively buried a colossal, meticulously catalogued graveyard of forgotten infants. The sheer scale of the collection, the dozens upon dozens of identical bundles, directly contradicted every single known reality of the valley. Oak Haven was a small, struggling settlement, while winter fevers and tragic stillbirths were a harsh reality of mountain life. There had not been this many dead children in the entire recorded history of the Hollow. Cora's stoic, hardened facade completely fractured. A profound, unadulterated panic completely hijacked her nervous system. She began to violently, frantically dig through the trunk, throwing the pristine linen bundles wildly over her shoulders, scattering the blood-stained garments, the locks of hair, and the blank, staring wooden dolls across the wet, mud-tracked floorboards of the kitchen. She dug deeper and deeper into the suffocating smell of mothballs, desperately searching for an explanation, a rational anchor, anything that could possibly explain the sheer, monstrous volume of the macabre shrines. Her bleeding hands reached the very bottom of the heavy wooden trunk, scraping violently against the bare, tar-sealed pine floor of the box. She did not find more linen. Her fingers brushed against the cold, heavy texture of aged, brass-bound leather, resting at the absolute, terrifying epicenter of the buried trunk, crushed beneath the immense, psychological weight of nearly 100. Infant shrines were 3 massive, incredibly thick, and perfectly preserved financial ledgers. Cora slowly pulled the heavy, leather-bound books from the depths of the trunk, the brass bindings clinking softly in the sudden dead silence of the kitchen. She laid the thick volumes carefully on the dining table, brushing a stray lock of pale infant hair from the polished oak, and slowly reached for the cover of the first ledger, completely unaware that the elegant handwriting inside was about to permanently, violently destroy the entire foundation of their world. The heavy brass latch of the first ledger yielded with a stiff, metallic click, a sound that seemed to temporarily sever the deafening roar of the thunderstorm battering the slate roof above them. Cora slowly opened the thick, leather-bound volume, the ancient, dried binding cracking loudly in the suffocating, lavender-choked air of the kitchen. She smoothed her trembling, dirt-caked hand over the first page of heavy, cream-colored parchment. The ink was dark, iron-gall black, applied with a meticulous, unwavering pressure. There was absolutely no room for denial, no fragile hope of a misunderstanding to cling to. It was the exact elegant, looping script of their mother, Eleanor Gable. It was the very same handwriting that meticulously recorded the valley's crop yields in the community almanac, the same gentle script that had inscribed the front pages of their childhood Bibles. But these pages contained no scripture. They contained a cold, calculated, and agonizingly methodical chronology of absolute devastation. Maeve leaned over her sister's shoulder, the weak, flickering amber light of the brass kerosene lantern washing over the meticulously drawn columns. The left side of the ledger was a chronological list of names and dates, stretching back decades into the harshest, most isolated years of Oakhaven's history. Cora's soot-stained finger slowly traced the very first entry on the page, her heart hammering a violent, frantic rhythm against her ribs. November 14th, 1883. Patient, Sarah Vance. Delivery, male. Constitution, robust, strong lungs. Maeve let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her frail hands flying to cover her mouth. She knew that date. The entire valley knew that date. It was etched permanently into the collective, grieving memory of the Hollow. That was the night of the great blizzard, the night Sarah Vance had endured an agonizing 3-day labor isolated in her freezing cabin. Mother Gable had been the only soul allowed in the room. When the dawn finally broke, it was Mother Gable who had emerged from the cabin, her face a mask of profound, saintly sorrow, carrying a tiny, tightly nailed pine box. She had told Elias Vance, the young, exhausted father, that the child had been strangled by the cord, a tragic, unavoidable stillbirth. Elias had dug the grave himself in the frozen, unyielding earth of the churchyard, his heart permanently, irreparably shattered. But Cora's trembling finger continued to trace the iron-gall ink horizontally across the parchment, moving from the left column to the right. Here, the grim reality of the pioneer tragedy violently dissolved into the cold, sociopathic mathematics of a heavily organized black market. Directly across from the name of Sarah Vance's supposedly dead son was a terrifyingly sterile entry. Client, the estate of Arthur Pendleton, Richmond, Virginia. Compensation, $800, Bank of Richmond draft. Conduit, Conductor Harrison, B&O Night Freight. The psychological whiplash was absolute, completely paralyzing the sisters in the dim, sweltering kitchen. $800 in 1883 was a staggering, practically mythical sum of money, a fortune that could have purchased half the timber rights in the entire valley. And it was only the first line. Driven by a morbid, terrifying compulsion, Cora began to frantically turn the thick, stiff pages of the ledger. The names blurred together in a horrifying, endless cascade of localized tragedy. Mary Higgins, 1885. Eliza Miller, 1888. Catherine Boyd, 1891. Dozens upon dozens of the local Oak Haven women. Every single entry correlated flawlessly with the community's known, deeply mourned history of tragic stillbirths and sudden, devastating winter fever infant fatalities. Whenever a child had supposedly died in the dead of the night, before the town doctor or the extended family could arrive to examine the body, Mother Gable had been there. The horrific, mind-shattering methodology of the saintly midwife crystallized in the suffocating shadows of the farmhouse. Eleanor Gable had never comforted grieving mountain mothers. She had systematically, methodically manufactured their grief. When she was called to an isolated timber cabin to deliver a child to a desperately poor, starving mountain family, she would assess the infant. If the child was healthy, robust, and marketable, the trap was set. She utilized her absolute, unquestioned medical authority to administer heavy, dangerous doses of liquid laudanum, plunging the exhausted, agonizingly vulnerable mothers into a deep, narcotic, and paralyzing sleep. In the dead, silent hours of the night, she would steal the healthy newborn dot to cover the horrific theft. She presented the devastated families with a monstrous, unfathomable lie. She wrapped deceased livestock, tightly swaddled and entirely covered, or the tragic, deformed remains of genuinely stillborn anomalies she had secretly preserved, and placed them in the sealed pine boxes. The grieving, heavily sedated parents, blindly trusting the saint of Oak Haven, never questioned the heavily nailed coffins they buried in the freezing mud of the churchyard. Meanwhile, Mother Gable would wrap the stolen, living infants in heavy blankets, strapping on her ashwood snowshoes, and hike miles through the blinding Appalachian blizzards, not to save lives, but to rendezvous with highly corrupted railroad conductors on the night freights. She was secretly brokering an entire generation of stolen mountain children to the wealthy, prominent, and barren socialite families of Charleston, Atlanta, and Richmond. She had transformed the poorest, most desperate hollow in the Smoky Mountains into her own private, highly lucrative breeding ground. Cora looked down at the blood-stained swaddling cloths, the perfectly preserved locks of fine infant hair, and the terrifying, featureless wooden dolls scattered violently across their kitchen floor. The macabre shrines suddenly made a sick, twisted sense. They were not monuments to the dead. They were the meticulously organized, deeply compartmentalized trophies of a prolific sociopathic human trafficker. The lock of hair clipped from the child's head before they were handed off to the train conductor. The bloodied cloth kept as proof of the harvest, and the blank, featureless wooden doll a grim, silent placeholder representing the soul she had violently ripped from its mother's arms, ensuring she kept a perfect, physical tally of her immense, horrific wealth. For 40 years, the entire valley of Oak Haven had dropped to their knees in the mud, weeping with profound, unconditional gratitude for a monster who was systematically stealing their bloodlines. The sisters sat in absolute, paralyzed silence, the deafening roar of the spring thunderstorm rattling the window panes, entirely consumed by the crushing, isolating psychological weight of the blood money buried beneath their boots. Which country are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments. The blood money buried beneath their boots. For an eternity, neither sister moved. The brass kerosene lantern flickered violently as a sudden freezing draft swept up from the gaping, jagged hole in the floorboards, casting long, trembling, and deeply grotesque shadows across the macabre sea of white linen bundles and blank wooden dolls. The realization of what their mother had actually been, not a pioneer saint, but a highly organized, apex predator feeding entirely on the most vulnerable, agonizing moments of human existence, completely and violently fractured their minds. Every single cherished memory they possessed of Eleanor Gable was instantly, irreversibly poisoned. The gentle, weathered hands that had stroked their hair at night were the exact same hands that had measured out heavy, dangerous doses of liquid, laudanum to drug exhausted, bleeding mothers. The soft, reassuring voice that had sung them ancient Appalachian hymns was the same voice that had coldly negotiated the price of stolen human life with corrupt railroad men in the freezing dark. Cora slowly slumped back into her rigid wooden chair, her hardened, stoic resilience entirely shattering. She stared blankly at her own calloused, dirt-caked hands. These were hands that had violently, endlessly worked this rocky, unforgiving farm for nearly 2 decades, completely unaware that the very foundation of their modest pioneer wealth, the heavy wool coats on their backs, and the heirloom seeds they planted every single spring were entirely funded by the agonizing, permanent grief of their neighbors. When Elias Vance, the aging gravedigger, tipped his hat to them in the village, his eyes permanently hollowed by the 20-year mourning of his supposedly stillborn son, he was unknowingly greeting the women whose comfortable lives were directly paid for by the sale of his only child. The suffocating, paralyzing guilt was a physical, crushing weight in the small kitchen, stealing the oxygen directly from Cora's lungs, but the nightmare hidden within the massive, tar-sealed steamer trunk had not yet entirely surrendered all of its dark secrets. Maeve, her face entirely devoid of color and streaked with tears, was unable to pull her gaze away from the open, heavily oxidized maw of the heavy wooden box. Driven by a morbid, terrifying, and completely involuntary compulsion to reach the absolute, physical bottom of their mother's sins, she slowly sank to her knees on the polished pine floorboards. She reached past the heavy, leather-bound ledgers, resting on the dining table, plunging her trembling hands back into the overwhelmingly thick, suffocating scent of dried lavender and toxic camphor. She violently pushed aside the few remaining pristine linen bundles, her fingernails scraping against the rough, tar-sealed floor of the massive trunk. Tucked away in the absolute furthest, darkest corner of the box, completely hidden beneath the staggering weight of the stolen infant's shrines, her hand brushed against smooth, polished wood dot, it was not another blank, featureless wooden doll. It was a small, intricately crafted, and beautifully preserved cedar box. It was entirely distinct from the heavy, industrial iron bindings of the main trunk, possessing a delicate, highly personal quality that immediately sent a fresh, paralyzing spike of pure dread directly up Maeve's spine. She pulled the small box free from the shadows, the rich, earthy scent of the aged cedar cutting sharply through the cloying odor of the mothballs. She carried it to the dining table, setting it gently down directly beside the open damning ledger. Of the Oakhaven missing, Cora slowly raised her head, her exhausted, bloodshot eyes locking onto the small wooden box. There was no heavy brass padlock securing this final secret. There was only a simple, delicate silver clasp. With a hand trembling so violently she could barely manipulate the metal, Maeve flipped the silver latch and slowly pushed the cedar lid open. Inside, there were no bloody swaddling cloths. There were no locks of fine infant hair, and there were no ledgers detailing the illicit transport of stolen mountain children. Resting neatly on a bed of dark green velvet were two folded, heavy pieces of official watermarked parchment. Maeve reached into the box and withdrew the first document. She carefully unfolded the heavy paper, holding it up to the weak flickering amber light of the kerosene lantern. It was an official, highly bureaucratic document bearing the heavily inked, authoritative stamp of the St. Jude Home for the Destitute and Orphaned, a massively overcrowded, deeply impoverished institution located nearly 300 miles away in the sprawling industrial smog of Atlanta, Georgia. It was a certificate of legal guardianship and authorized purchase. It detailed the transfer of a female infant, completely unnamed and designated only by an institutional serial number, to a Mrs. Eleanor Gable for the substantial, staggering administrative fee of $150, but it was the date meticulously typed at the very bottom of the certificate that violently, completely stopped Maeve's heart in her chest. April 14, 1877. Maeve dropped the heavy parchment onto the oak table as if it had suddenly burst into scalding flames. She frantically, desperately reached back into the cedar box and grabbed the second folded document. She tore it open, her eyes darting wildly across the heavily inked text. It was an identical certificate of purchase from the exact same distant orphanage, authorizing the transfer of a second unnamed female infant. The date typed at the bottom of the second page was September 2, 1875. The absolute, mind-shattering revelation violently tore through the small, damp kitchen, completely obliterating the final, fragile remnants of their reality. September 1875 and April 1877. They were the exact, undeniable dates of Cora and Maeve's respective birthdays. The two women stared at the official documents, their civilized, rational minds violently short-circuiting as the horrific, unadulterated truth finally crystallized. They were not biological sisters. They did not share a single drop of blood. And most terrifyingly of all, they were not even Gables. Eleanor Gable, the saintly revered matriarch of Oakhaven, the woman who had spent 40 years delivering the children of the Hollow, was completely, entirely barren. She could not bear children of her own. But a single, childless woman living in deep Appalachian isolation, suddenly accumulating vast, unexplained wealth while the infants around her tragically died, would have immediately drawn the aggressive, violent suspicion of the deeply superstitious mountain community. Eleanor needed an impenetrable cover. She needed the absolute, unquestionable facade of a devoted, maternal, and struggling pioneer mother to perfectly mask her horrific, lucrative black market empire. So, she had traveled to the desperate, overflowing orphanages of the Deep South and simply purchased her alibi. She had bought Cora and Maeve. The psychological devastation inflicted upon the two women in that freezing, lantern-lit room was absolute, profound, and practically unsurvivable. Their entire identity, their deeply bonded sisterhood, and their entire lineage was a cold, calculated, and entirely fabricated lie. They had not been raised with the fierce, unconditional love of a pioneer mother. They had been meticulously raised as highly effective, living props. They were the physical camouflage that allowed Eleanor Gable to move completely unquestioned through the grieving, devastated cabins of Oak Haven. Every single time Cora had proudly stood beside her mother at Sunday service, every time Maeve had dutifully carried the heavy leather medical bag through the blinding winter snows, they had been actively, unknowingly protecting the very monster who was stealing the community's children. They were not daughters. They were the ultimate, most successful investments Eleanor Gable had ever made, purchased for a few $100s, yielding decades of free, back-breaking farm labor, unquestioning loyalty, and the perfect, saintly reputation required to steal. Hundreds of infants without ever drawing a single suspicious glance from the town. They had spent their entire lives as the unwitting, indentured accomplices to the greatest atrocity the Smoky Mountains had ever seen. The greatest atrocity the Smoky Mountains had ever seen. The silence that followed this mind-shattering realization was not peaceful. It was a heavy, pressurized vacuum that violently pressed against their eardrums, completely drowning out the deafening roar of the spring thunderstorm raging outside the farmhouse. Cora and Maeve sat completely paralyzed on the polished pine floorboards, surrounded by the horrific, scattered wreckage of a sociopathic empire. The suffocating, medicinal stench of dried lavender and toxic camphor seemed to physically coat the back of their throats, a constant, sickening reminder of the aggressive preservation of their mother's monstrous legacy. They looked at each other. Across the dim, flickering amber light of the brass kerosene lantern, completely stripped of their shared history. They did not share a mother. They did not share a bloodline. They were simply two discarded, nameless orphans purchased from the Fengest, from the sprawling, industrial slums of Atlanta for the sole, terrifying purpose of serving as the living, breathing camouflage for a prolific human trafficker. As the bruised, pitch-black hours of the night crawled agonizingly onward, the initial paralyzing shock slowly, violently mutated into a profound, suffocating panic. The heavy, leather-bound ledgers rested open on the dining table, the iron gall ink boldly detailing the names of every stolen infant and the staggering financial drafts paid by the wealthy, barren elite of Richmond and Charleston. The undeniable, physical evidence of the atrocity was completely unearthed, sitting squarely in the center of their kitchen. The sisters were faced with a singular, terrifying, and completely impossible choice. Cora's stoic, hardened pioneer pragmatism, though severely fractured, desperately tried to assert control over her racing mind. She looked at the ledgers, and she visualized the agonizing, inevitable sequence of events if they were to wrap the thick volumes in oilcloth and carry them down into the valley at first light. She imagined laying the books on the heavy oak desk of the town magistrate. She imagined the hardened, deeply superstitious, and heavily armed men of Oak Haven reading the names of their supposedly dead children. The absolute, apocalyptic reaction of the Hollow was terrifyingly easy to predict. The deeply ingrained, collective grief of Oak Haven, a grief that had been endured with stoic, religious resilience for 40 years, would instantly, violently curdle into a blind, unadulterated, and mind-shattering rage. Men like Elias Vance, who had spent 20 years visiting A tiny, unmarked grave in the frozen churchyard would not find peace in the truth. The agonizing realization that his son had not died a tragic natural death, but had been heavily drugged, violently stolen in the dead of the night, and sold to a wealthy stranger hundreds of miles away, would completely and permanently destroy his sanity. The families of the valley would realize that their children were out there, raised by strangers, entirely unrecoverable and forever lost to them. The mercy of a finalized natural death would be violently replaced by the unending, torturous, psychological agony of a stolen life, and the wrath of the hollow would not be contained to the ledger. The starving, heartbroken mountain families would violently descend upon the churchyard. They would tear Eleanor Gable's fresh grave apart, with their bare hands, completely desecrating her corpse in a frenzy of pure visceral vengeance. And then their hollow, bloodshot eyes would inevitably turn up the ridge toward the ancient, sagging farmhouse. They would look at Cora and Maeve, the two women who had unknowingly eaten the food, worn the heavy wool coats, and lived in the Viv. Comfortable home entirely funded by the blood and permanent grief of their neighbors. The town would not care about the certificates of purchase from the Atlanta orphanage. In their blinding, collective madness, they would only see the accomplices. They would barricade the heavy oak doors from the outside and burn the farmhouse completely to the ground, incinerating the sisters alive in a desperate, fiery purge of the ultimate betrayal. Cora slowly raised her head, her exhausted, bloodshot eyes meeting Maeve's terrified gaze. They did not need to speak a single word to reach the agonizing, mutual consensus. To expose the horrific truth would completely, irreversibly destroy the fragile psychological survival of the entire valley, and it would absolutely result in their own violent, immediate executions. Justice for the stolen children of Oak Haven was a luxury they simply could not afford to pursue. They had to choose the crushing, isolating burden of absolute silence. They had to become exactly what their mother had always intended them to be, the perfect, unquestioning accomplices. With a heavy, leaden finality, Cora pushed herself up from the floorboards. She walked to the massive stone hearth and grabbed the heavy iron fire poker, violently, aggressively stoking the dying embers until they flared into a roaring, hungry blaze. She did not instruct Maeve. She simply began the grim, agonizing task of total historical erasure. Cora gathered the pristine white linen bundles from the floor. She carried the tiny, heavily faded swaddling cloths deeply stained with the rusted blood of the harvest, and threw them directly into the roaring fire. The ancient fabric caught instantly, a bright, aggressive yellow flame illuminating the dark kitchen as the evidence of the stolen infants violently curled and turned to gray ash. Maeve, weeping silently, joined her sister. She gathered the perfectly preserved locks of fine infant hair and the terrifying, featureless wooden dolls. They threw the macabre trophies into the hearth, the thick pine of the dolls popping and hissing loudly, the blank, staring oval faces slowly blackening and splitting in the intense heat. The suffocating smell of camphor and lavender was rapidly, violently overpowered by the acrid, sickening stench of burning hair and scorched wood. But the ultimate, most agonizing act of complicity was the destruction of the ledgers. Cora carried the 3 incredibly thick brass-bound volumes to the edge of the hearth. These pages contained the only remaining proof that the stolen generation of Oak Haven had ever existed. They contained the true identities of the children, the dates of their theft, and the exact locations of the wealthy families who had purchased them. Tossing the ledgers into the fire was an absolute, unforgivable sin against the grieving mothers of the valley. Cora's hands trembled violently, the heavy heat of the fire blistering her skin, but she did not hesitate. She violently threw the thick, leather-bound books directly into the absolute center of the roaring flames. The heavy brass bindings shrieked as they warped in the heat. The thick, cream-colored parchment caught fire, the elegant, iron-gall handwriting of Mother Gable melting and blackening, entirely erasing the names of the missing children from the history of the world. Finally, Maeve approached the fire, holding the small cedar box and the 2 official certificates of purchase from the Atlanta orphanage. With a sharp, ragged gasp, she threw the documents into the flames completely, permanently destroying the only tangible proof of their own true identities. By the time the bruised, exhausted gray light of dawn finally broke over the jagged peaks of the Smoky Mountains, the violent spring thunderstorm had completely passed. The massive, tar-sealed steamer trunk had been violently broken down with an iron axe and burned in the hearth, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a massive, smoking pile of white ash and melted brass hardware. The sisters meticulously swept the floorboards, completely scrubbing the suffocating scent of lavender from the wood with harsh lye soap, and nailed the heavy pine floorboards permanently back into place over the empty dirt pit in the foundation. The physical evidence of the greatest atrocity the mountains had ever seen was completely, irreversibly obliterated. Later that morning, as the thick, heavy mountain fog slowly began to burn off the valley floor, Cora and Maeve Gable stepped out onto the sagging wooden porch of their farmhouse. They were utterly exhausted, their faces pale and drawn, their souls permanently, irreparably stained by the horrific secret they had chosen to bury in their own minds. Walking slowly up the muddy, rutted wagon trail toward the house was Elias Vance, the aging gravedigger. He held his worn felt hat in his hands, his posture hunched with the perpetual, heavy weight of his 20-year grief. He stopped at the edge of the property line, offering a frail, deeply respectful nod to the 2 sisters. "Mornin', girls," Elias rasped, his voice thick with unadulterated, innocent gratitude. "I just wanted to come up and pay my respects again. Your mother, she was a true saint to this valley. We wouldn't have survived the winters without her. The Lord has a special place for a woman like Mother Gable." Cora stood entirely frozen. On the porch, the sickeningly sweet smell of burning hair and scorched leather still violently clinging to the fabric of her wool dress, she looked into the hollow, trusting, and deeply heartbroken eyes of the man whose healthy, living son had funded the very timber she was standing on. A psychological devastation was absolute, a crushing, suffocating weight that would never, ever be lifted from her chest. Cora Gable forced the corners of her mouth upward into a fragile, trembling smile, nodding politely to the grieving father. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice completely hollow, entirely devoid of life. "She loved this valley. She loved us all." Elias tipped his hat and slowly walked away, completely unaware of the monstrous truth buried in the ashes of the farmhouse hearth. And as the morning sun finally broke through the heavy mountain fog, the 2 sisters turned and walked back into the dark, silent kitchen, forever trapped in the isolated, mist-shrouded valley of Oakhaven, condemned to carry the agonizing, mind-shattering burden of their mother's sins until the very day they died.